Welcome to Earth Common Journal, The Launch Pod, where we invite authors, dignitaries, and guests to discuss our annual theme in an on-the-ground podcast series. Great. Bravo. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming to today's episode. And we're featuring Echoes of the Valley. So this is a podcast episode about a podcast series. So we're getting a little bit meta here. And we have Emily and Elyse, who are the authors of Echoes of the Valley. And we have one of our resident editors for the podcast series, Claire. And one of our international editors, Eska, is unable to make this podcast meeting, but he will be featured in an upcoming episode. So stay tuned for that. All right, well, again, thank you for coming here and being able to talk on the mic. I'm sure that you're not as nervous as many of our other authors are, because this is exactly what you did for Earth Common Journal, was supply a podcast. I just want to get an idea of how did this idea come to be? Where did this podcast start?
Yeah, thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
I think Emily and I really nurtured our relationship working together on other group projects throughout our degrees. And we both kind of found ourselves pretty passionate about the topic this year, which was influence, and how individuals, I suppose, are able to influence larger change movements on a local scale.
Why specifically infrastructure?
I think when looking at what the individual can do to push the climate adaptation movement forward, it's really easy to look at smaller things, I suppose, like plastic straws or paper cups. But in my opinion, what will really drive change on an individual level is getting involved in local government, making those pushes for policy change. We really wanted to showcase the power of the individual within the local government sphere.
And how did you come to find out about these people who found their agency and then started to create a conversation with the government and how they wanted to plan their communities and, you know, kind of how highways would affect the way that they lived in their communities? How did you first find out about that?
I personally worked on another podcast called A Little Bit Richie, and we looked at this movement of local highways. And that's where I first heard about the specific Metropolitan Edmonton Transportation Study, which is something that we talk about in our podcast, and looked a lot at the civic movements surrounding the Metropolitan Edmonton Transportation Study, and just how individuals got involved and pushed for that change. As well, the 15-minute cities conversation was quite topical at the time. And Emily and I kind of noticed a connection between the two.
Yeah, so we wanted, as Elyse said, to specifically look at individual members, but also how members go on to make up communities which also influence change. So not just individual people, but individuals within a community, within a group, within that become organizations, institutions, like it kind of breaking it down in reverse. Instead of focusing on just individuals and just organizations, it's like, well, how do individuals become a group that are able to exert an amount of influence? Because it's never just one person. It always is a group eventually that has more power than just one person. And so we wanted to look at it from that micro level and then also as it builds up into the macro level. So.
Yeah, and as you were saying, Elyse, that you had worked with the Ritchie Community League to produce another podcast, and so that's how you started to understand this story and community, and what Emily is saying about the importance of looking at a community level versus individual is through your research or through your experience with that community league, what sort of unique points or aspects of that community helped them to see this project, to see their advocation to fruition, to actually change the way that the government was planning their neighborhood?
I think pride in the community was a big a big element of that. The people who were involved in the process adored their public space. The people who were involved in that project adored their public space. They had a quite tight connection to the green spaces in their community. And they're also, through history, through the history of the Ritchie neighborhood, there's been a consistent trend of civic responsibility and a drive to improve and change the community. Ritchie is not a neighborhood that in its history has been quiet. They were one of the first neighborhoods in the city to have a community league, and even to this day are at the forefront of public discussion in terms of discussion around housing, discussions around housing, discussions around houselessness. They are very active in their community and in the greater community of Edmonton. So to answer your question, I think civic pride, empowerment, proximity to the university helps as well. Just having a lot of people within that community who are passionate and willing to push back is very important. I think it creates a domino effect so that regular people like us feel like we can do something in our community.
I think that that civic pride and responsibility is something that we found in both areas of our podcast and our paper. A lot of the movements, whether it's for the environment or movements that hinder sustainability efforts, they both have a sense of pride and responsibility, where in this particular case that we looked at with Mill Creek Ravine and also the 15-minute cities, is that pride and responsibility is at the center, but where the direction that it's aimed at and the intention, I guess, behind it and the goals of it are where it starts to go a bit astray. In the past, with Mill Creek Ravine, as Elyse said, we saw that pride and responsibility fuel something good to protect the environment, to protect green spaces, because the community felt a responsibility towards that. Whereas with the 15-minute cities, there is still that pride and civic responsibility that they're feeling towards their communities and a protectiveness. The problem is that it's the intention behind it is where the misguidance sort of comes from, is that they think, or we found that they believe that they're protecting their community but when you actually look at what's happening and what the result of their actions is going to be, it's actually the opposite. And so that's where the contrast came in with this particular project.
Do you think that there would be a level of misguidedness that would be, like how that might have changed between the Mill Creek situation towards the 15-minute city and the ways that we consume information? Like, how do you think, like, is that part of it, or what else would be a contributing factor to being misguided?
With the 15-minute city, protests, particularly in Edmonton, there were people that were taking advantage of people's pride and responsibility in their community, and I think that was a contributing factor, is that there were people that were involved in those protests that were invited to visit and speak at those protests that were not from the community. They were from other provinces with alternative agendas that took advantage of basically people wanting their communities to be safe and welcoming, I guess. And like, people do have pride and have a responsibility to protect those communities, but there are people out there that want to take advantage of that and feed misinformation into that, and that hinders sustainability efforts. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm not explaining that very well.
I think too, in the case of METS, the Metropolitan Edmonton Transportation Study, that was a pushback against a grassroots movement. That was a pushback against an issue that was localized, specifically happening in Edmonton. Residents were upset about something that started in Edmonton that would affect Edmonton. Whereas in the case of the 15-minute cities, this is more of a global movement that can create a lot of uproar when people aren't necessarily educated about the specifics of the situation. In our research, we found that a lot of these people were misrepresenting the core issue of 15-minute cities proposals. Like, people thought that they wouldn't be allowed to leave their districts, when that's not at all the case. So I think the internet plays a big role in spreading misinformation surrounding sustainability efforts, whereas obviously the internet wasn't around during METS. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about sharing space, and I think that's what a community is. I guess it can be digital space as well too, but if we look at a community league, it's, you share the sidewalk, you share the amenities with me, we share a conversation or like a high five or like a hello at the grocery store. And how that shift of being the physical space to finding community on the digital space, and again, like how things can, like the values can be misaligned, or how the values, they actually share the values still, but perhaps how people feel it's interpreted, or like what are the actions going to be as far as like a 15-minute city. Like, we want to make sure that there's grocery stores within a 15-minute radius, or it's that you can only shop at that grocery store within a 15-minute radius. And I guess who would be behind wanting to misguide it? Like, for what reasons?
Well, and it's kind of ironic because you'd think that the internet creates space for conversation and understanding, I suppose. But
you think?
You think. But in reality, like, there's not a lot of space for discourse. And I don't know, I'm not one of those people, but when we're talking about something that's happening on a community scale that's with interpersonal face-to-face interactions, people are a lot more likely to hear the other side. Whereas on the internet, you see something and you get upset and you react on that gut feeling of upsettedness, without necessarily trying to understand where the other person is coming from. So I think, just understanding and discussion are extremely important in these conversations.
Well, what about protests? Because that's in person.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you find in the Mill Creek situation as far as like protests and that? Were people able to have a conversation, or do protests inherently remove the opportunity for conversation?
Mm-hmm. It was tough during that time. There were a lot of organizations that were involved. And this isn't just a Ritchie or a Mill Creek issue. This was all of Edmonton's River Valley was under threat, essentially. You saw protests from organizations like Stop Pollution, Oppose Tomorrow. An acronym. And Urge, Urban Reform. Of course, I know the beginnings, but not the end. Stop, Urge, among others. Mill Creek, Build a Park was another one. Huge protests. And they were often labeled by the Edmonton Journal specifically as radicalists. Nobody really took them seriously at the beginning. It was very hot. So it's not to say that the efforts to stop this freeway were tame at all. It was heated, just as 15-minute cities debate has been heated. But I think when we're looking at things that are happening face-to-face versus online, there's more room for gray.
Mm-hmm. And the translation from local to global, because the 15-minute cities, the uproar with that did not happen in Canada. It originated in the UK, and then it caught fire, essentially, and spread, and people started getting scared. And so with that, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation and misrepresentation.
What did you find from your research that you did not know going into it that kind of surprised you when it comes to fears or how things get done civically, government?
What did we find that surprised us in terms of civic issues in government? I think this isn't necessarily government, but I think the response from the media in both of these occurrences was quite interesting. I remember my coworker at the Ritchie Community League, Linnea Bell, did a ton of research about the freeway, which is how I've learned a lot of these things. And I remember her showing me articles from the Edmonton Journal, from the 60s, that really struggled to understand the cause that these people were fighting for. As I mentioned before, like just labeled as radicalists.
They were very dismissive as well.
Very dismissive. And I that's not necessarily surprising, I suppose, but
I think it was more the fact that things haven't changed much.
Could we also say that with enough time, whatever we deem as radical actually might not be as radical in the future? So, for example, we may say what had happened in the past with Mill Creek, these people helped to preserve a community that, as Edmontonians, which we all are, can understand that area is it's rich in community. It's got novel stores. It's a very shop local. It's a scene. It's a vibe. And to think that there was a highway that was going to go through, like that would have been completely different. And just how we use, labels and how those labels shift over time. So is it, should we ever pay attention to what someone deems as radical? Because perhaps in the future it may not seem that way. Or if like a term like radical is neither positive nor negative. It's just somebody who wants to what? I wonder, because I'm sure that you looked back on Mill Creek situation and thought it was kind of unjustified to call them radicals. Like they were just wanting to preserve their community. But now we could think that the radicalization for 15-minute city fever and people who are in opposition of that, those radicals, or the people who lead them are radicals, or the people who oppose them are radicals, or, it's kind of like when a word doesn't have meaning over time.
Yeah, like people who protest anything, basically, are viewed as radical, which you're right. Like, is that a bad thing? Like, how are we interpreting the word radical?
The ability to protest, the importance of doing that, and having some democratic procedure in which to, I don't know, not rectify the situation or pass through whatever it is that people are protesting or counter-protesting or push back. Yeah. Claire, for you as an editor, what was your understanding of civic infrastructure and policy, or the 15-minute city, or the Mill Creek Highway? Like, did you know about these things prior to coming in to edit, or was this like a new exploration for you?
I did have some familiarity with the 15-minute city protest, just because it was at the time at the time it happened, it was like all over the news. It was very highly reported on. So I was aware of that. I was not aware of first off, the history of industrialization in the River Valley, which both the paper and the podcast kind of talk about from its origins as excuse me, from its origins as originally part of the Papas-Chase Nation, towards its industrial development as part of the railway and just like the industry that grew there as well. Like there were factories, there was what's the word I'm looking for?
Meat packing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The factories, there were meat packing plants. I wasn't aware that there was such a heavily industrialized side to the River Valley, just because like touching on what we see as kind of just normalized now, is the River Valley is such a huge part of Edmonton life, and it's such a green space that I think as citizens and community members in Edmonton that we are so proud of, and we really kind of talk up and take the time to enjoy when the weather is good too. And thinking of that there was this highway that was just planned, or thinking that there was this freeway that was just planned that would have just gone right through it and destroyed so much of that beautiful forest we have in our city that we see as such an oasis here, was really quite shocking to me. And so it was really interesting to hear the history behind that and the actions that, like, those the actions of those protesters that we're kind of gaining the benefits from today, having that beautiful green space in our city.
It's so wild, like, just to jump off that and to kind of circle back to your question about surprises. When I was researching and learning about Mill Creek Ravine, one of the things that shocked me the most was learning that it is one of the most polluted green spaces in Alberta.
I was just going to say, yes,
if
the pollution.
If any of y'all are interested, there's a fascinating dissertation by Dr. Hayden Stewart called In the Shadow of Industry, all about Mill Creek Ravine and its industrial past. Dr. Stewart, did extensive archaeological digs and found incredible things like remnants of bone, clinker, which is a byproduct of coal, brick. Like, it is so wacky to me to think about, like, little kids playing in the river, like dogs running around, like people having a great time, like thinking that they're in this clean, like, natural oasis, but not knowing what is, like, literally 6 inches below the surface of dirt. And that is something that I find so inspiring and interesting about the story of Mill Creek Ravine, is that it, was this barren wasteland for so long, and now it's kind of come back to this, like, beautiful natural state, even though all of this horrific remnants lies below. I think that's very poetic and interesting.
It's like its own, like, reclamation project in and of itself.
Yeah.
Oh.
And now there's a very popular festival, the Flying Canoe Festival, that's held within Mill Creek Ravine, and one of my favorite winter festivals. And speaking of, like, interesting places in the river valley, is Rundle Park, which is further east down the river from Mill Creek Ravine, is a park built on top of a dump. So I grew up on the north side, and one of my best friends, she lived in Clairview, so we would go to Rundle Park sometimes to hang out and bike and all that kind of situation. And we remember, like, being driven down there with the parents' vehicle, and the roads, if you've ever driven to Rundle Park, they're very hilly. It's interesting, like, and I started hearing, tales of, like, oh yeah, this used to be a dump, and that's why there's so many hills, because the garbage keeps moving underground and, like, moving the roads. And it's part of, like, you have to be Edmontonian to understand the north side is seen as, like, a garbage wasteland of people and places. I proudly represent in that sense. And
Ditto.
then just to say that, yeah, one of our big parks is a literal garbage heap.
Yeah.
Like, it just, we put some grass on top of it,
Yeah.
put some sod. There you go, a swing site. Have at our north siders.
Yeah.
But it is interesting,
Well,
but also kind of inspiring to say, like, well, what do we do with trash? We put a park on top of it.
Yeah. And even talking about, I could go on about this for hours. I am obsessed with the history of Mill Creek Ravine now. But even looking at this, like, natural reclamation, so much of it is carigana, which is an invasive species that was introduced, I think, in the 1930s. Don't quote me on this. I say on a podcast. I believe by Frank Lloyd Wright. No, that's incorrect. I'll have to fact check myself. But by this urban planner who wanted to beautify the city. He was, like, a very famous urban planner in Alberta. And yeah, just introduced all this carigana throughout Edmonton. So now whenever you're on your little walk and you're like, oh, it's gorgeous here, it's likely all invasive carigana that's choked out so many natural species.
It's a noxious weed. Is that what you're?
It is,
yes.
yeah.
Same thing with the thistle.
Yes, and the sea buckthorn, which is delicious, by the way. Little orange berries on a beautiful spiky tree.
They're, like, as far as, like, some of the invasive species, if you harvest them, you can also eat them. Like, not all of them, but I have been doing some research on, like, oh, what do you do with noxious weeds? Pull them out and eat them.
Totally.
Yeah. So get them while you can. Yeah. Well, so you're saying that you're obsessed with Mill Creek Ravine and history. Where is that obsession going to take you?
Good question. I think that Edmonton is funny in that we all kind of hate Edmonton. Like, I love Edmonton, but I would also leave if I didn't have roots, you know? It's this funny place where people always leave, but I feel like they always come back. And it feels like transient in a sense, but it's also home. So I would love to go in a direction that you could really harbor this love of Edmonton, you know, talk about the history of the city. And it's not pretty, to be fair. The history of Edmonton is horrific and disgusting, but it's also interesting. So I would love to be able to work in spreading the information of the history of Edmonton.
Yeah, I think it's important to uncover the pleasant and the unpleasant, especially if there's lots of unpleasant, because there's lessons to learn from that. There's lessons to see even in what you had found with the Mill Creek Ravine and its ability to recover, or that community to thrive, and sort of the changes it had to go through over different generations to get there, and to have a conversation on, you know, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? How can we change? How can we stop change? You know, those like salient themes that people could listen to from your podcast. Maybe we can have a little brief discussion about that. Or what are the elements that are needed when someone wants to make change in their community, or to prevent something from changing within reason, obviously? Can you think of what those main elements would be? And this is a question directed to both authors and editor, as being kind of a little bit intimate with the material.
I think a collaboration and a connection with the Indigenous community in your areas is of utmost importance. I don't think that changes for the positive really can be made without that collaboration and that fostering of connection.
What does that do? Like, what does that relationship do for the changes?
I think building a more robust understanding of space and the relationship to place that we are occupying as settlers is very important. Putting Indigenous voices at the forefront will ultimately improve the situation for everyone involved. Indigenous people have been silenced for so long, and it's so important that their voices are elevated now, especially when we're talking about their home and the changes that are being made to their home.
Who would you want to talk to, or who did you talk to or reach out to help inform you in relation to that?
We did attempt to reach out to the Papas Cheese community. We had a bit of a tricky time just navigating those waters, I suppose, just in the time limitations that we had, and the organizational restraints that were upon us when we were specifically doing the Richie podcast. My coworker and I personally didn't feel like that was our realm as interns at this organization. However, it's something we really pushed for and something that we gathered so much material to do. Yeah.
And then for possibly future seasons, to maybe build in a process to make those connections.
Absolutely.
And have that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we would love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we can help figure out a way of doing that.
Totally.
Making that a possibility, for sure. So we have one aspect, being able to represent historic voices of the land and understanding of the land. Emily, do you have something to add to as far as like what kind of themes are most important for someone wanting to enact civic change, or a community to enact civic change?
Honestly, bringing ideas to leaders within the community. In my opinion, like, no idea is too small. Like, you see a lot of high school students these days running sustainability campaigns and campaigning their community leaders and what are they called? Your local district.
MLAs?
Yeah,
Right.
thank you. I'm not a. Yes, thank you. Municipal government. I'm not great with remembering political titles. Yeah, just reaching out to people within your community to see if people feel similarly. Because a lot of the time, some people are just kind of just sitting around and they will complain in their own homes or just, you know, talk about it. Like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if that changed? But until you know if other people feel that way, like it might be easier than people think it is to band together to create change, is basically what I'm getting at. All you need to do is talk to people and talk to people within your community, because the more people that feel a certain way, that find out that other people also feel that way, they're more likely to come together to do something about it. So,
Can you speak to, for the Mill Creek Ravine, who were those community leaders? Did they identify themselves? Was it sort of just broad? How'd they find each other?
I believe there were a couple. There were the Nutters.
Yes, Richard and Carolyn Nutter
Yes.
were the big players at the forefront of Mill Creek Ravine. I believe Carolyn Nutter was a student at the U of A, and she used her connections with her like environmentalist groups at the U of A to rally a group of people together. They also went door to door. The two of them went door to door with a petition and got a huge percentage of the Ritchie residents and Hazeldean residents to sign. Butch and Carolyn Nutter.
Yeah. This took place during the 70s, I believe, 60s and 70s.
Yes.
When people would still answer their door if it
Yes.
was knocked on? I'm just
So,
trying to think like...
no internet, campaigning door to door,
Yeah.
petitions.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Old school.
Right. I wonder how that could be translated today when you have apartment complexes and it's really hard to get inside. And are you throwing like things onto people's balconies, being like,
Right.
read this note?
Well, and I fully don't answer my door. It's like if I'm sitting in my front room and I make eye contact with a solicitor, I still don't answer the door.
Yeah. Don't show up looking like you're trying to sell religion or
Nope.
or vacuum.
Home
Yeah.
security, like
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Right. So I guess, people would turn to social media to try and knock on people's doors, you know, or I would
Community leagues, even.
Yep.
community leagues, or I'm thinking of like community hubs. Like where do locals go? And I
Yeah.
think cafes have always been like a great place for me to form community and to like keep up with like people. I can just looking at people that I've seen over the past 7 years, and
Yeah.
you know, I don't even have to share a conversation. Just know they're alive. They're
That's how
still
we met.
ordering. Yes, right. And then just I guess you could establish a rapport from there. If you can't knock on their door, you're like, well, I'll see you at the cafe next Tuesday. So,
Right.
Yeah. What about you, Claire? Was there anything that you found particularly salient to, you know, how do people come about civic change?
I'm kind of drawing a blank. My mind's not firing on all cylinders today.
It's okay. Mine isn't either, if you can tell.
Well, even if it wasn't something that was related to the articles, what maybe, so we're all communication students, and we've all journalism as well too represented. What we've like come to understand as far as spreading the word, communicating, bringing together people for a shared common interest. What sort of things have you learned that are somewhat essential, if not essential, to advocating, grouping people together for something?
Well, I think like Emily mentioned, like finding those finding that community and the community spaces. Like we're definitely stronger as a group than as just one person doing something. That's really one of the ways to make change, for sure.
Yeah, and I think Edmonton, as far as I understand, is very unique in its active community leagues. I don't know of many other Canadian cities that have as established community leagues. I grew up, again, on the north side, and my dad was the president of our community league. My mom was like the treasurer for years. So like I grew up understanding that there was this thing that people did, and all the kids would be some sort of feral group playing together while our parents were voting on random stuff like playground equipment, and we're going to put this festival in or something like that. So it always seemed like very apparent. But when I moved to Vancouver and when I lived elsewhere, I realized that's not a given. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has that. And it's really interesting because that's volunteer. Yes. This is a bunch of people putting in hours for the sake of community, and that's something special. And I think that there's something there to even like hone in on it, like why Edmonton, and why is it still working, and what does that do, and are we not activating its potential? Mm-hmm. If people are already putting in volunteer hours, like, how does that play into 15-minute cities? Isn't every community a 15-minute radius-ish to a degree? And maybe like not using the 15-minute label, like maybe that word's no longer usable because it's radicalized.
It's tainted.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Got to keep inventing up new words, mm-hmm. right? Like,
yeah, Edmonton is so unique in the community league structure. And I again could talk for hours about Edmonton's community leagues. Like that is such a deep dive. I mean, that's a movement that was born out of a lot of civic responsibility, of course, and drive to take action, but also born out of some really bizarre social movements. I believe one of them was the social center movement. Just these movements that were very concerned about the corruption of their children and how can we save the children and keep children safe. However, I think they've kind of evolved into something better. Edmonton was really unique too in that the city housed a lot of soldiers during post-World War II. So a lot of the houses that were built were for soldiers and their families. Again, huge rabbit hole. But there's a lot of historical events that have kind of culminated to make Edmonton's community leagues what they are today, which I don't want to plug my own podcast, but if you listen to A Little Bit Richie, we talk about all these things.
Plug away. I was just going to say we have, opportunity for more series with Echoes of the Valley or furthermore. So we're always interested in being able to explore more of these ideas. And for people who live in this city, it's interesting, but I think that there are universal themes in here. Like what is it that people can learn from Edmonton in the way that it was able to create change civically, infrastructural wise? What other cities share the same sort of culture and how they're able to do it, and how can that be applied if that's exactly what people want to do?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about the community leagues is that Edmonton, one thing with the 15-minute cities and Edmonton's current city plan and urban planning is the mention of districts in Edmonton. And this term scared a lot of people. It's one of the buzzwords that ended up coming up a lot in the 15-minute city movement. But it's something that's always existed in Edmonton. It's only the modern reference to these districts within the city, in that people interpreted it as a very dystopian future, as in you will be confined to your district.
It's the Hunger Games too.
I was
just the
just
districts, right?
Just like the Hunger Games.
Isn't there another movie that's like some sort of like horror that's called like District Number 9 or something? Like I feel like it's kind of in our unconsciousness when it comes to district means dystopian. Yeah, like it's like we need a better word because like it's activating the wrong thing in people's heads.
It equals like restriction of movement, basically restriction of movement. But the thing is like just like the community leagues, these districts have always existed. It's only now that they've decided to label them as districts that people are freaking out about it. And it's because of these groups within Edmonton who have similar beliefs as the people in Oxford who also freaked out about the 15-minute communities, which low traffic neighborhoods have always existed in the UK since the 1970s. Again, it's not a new concept. It's been around for a long time, and it's only now that urban planners are looking at implementing more of these to make people's lives easier, to make it so that you don't have to drive. Like, it's all about the option. It's actually about the freedom of movement, that you can choose how you want to get around. You can use your car. You can take the bus. You can ride a bike. You can walk if you really want to. It's not about, kicking you out and like saying no. It's about saying yes. It's about saying you can do all of these things now, not like, no, you cannot drive your car. You're not allowed because it's bad for the environment. It's like, no, like these are some options. It's all about options. But for some reason, it just got flipped around. And that's where we see the power of influence, whereas in the Mill Creek community, it was being used to protect and encourage people to pay attention to green spaces and sustainability for the future. And now it's the intention of that influence is to inhibit and actually restrict people's options for the future because of its impact on green spaces. And it's not necessarily an anti-sustainability movement. Sustainability is kind of getting hit by the shrapnel of it. It's a side effect, that it's not directly like we're going to crap all over sustainability because we hate 15 minutes. We hate being able to walk to the grocery store. Like, people don't understand that that's what the 15-minute cities are. And by default, it's affecting people's attitudes towards sustainability, because now that they're hating on these urban planning concepts, that they don't quite understand what they mean for their actual life and the practical application of them, that it's creating a bad taste in their mouths when it comes to other sustainability movements. And by default, it's creating bad attitudes about them. And that's where the influence comes in with that. Whereas in the past, the influence was helping and aiding our protection of green spaces. And now, as a side effect in the future, we're seeing how influence is actually damaging people's views towards sustainability movements. So,
yeah, or like too much influence too often, too readily available versus, the influence I have is with my neighbor, the person who I have shared time and space with, versus someone who's got a really well edited video who other people proclaim to be quite popular because look at the amount of followers that they have. I think there's a huge and that talks about identity. What's different between Britain and Edmonton starkly for me is that we have a car culture. The way that London was planned was goat trails, and that's why they don't have a grid. We have a grid because it's the most efficient for cars. London's roads are not efficient for cars. And so what became more apparent to create more of a grid line was to put trains underground and get people moving faster, because cars actually weren't the fastest mode of transportation necessarily. And Edmonton was built around the time that the cars came around. And just thinking like the Mill Creek Ravine, people weren't thinking of how it was maybe going to harm the green spaces or people who were going to be walking. They were just thinking of, how do I get cars more efficiently across the valley? And that seems to be like a default thought for, if you look at Edmonton and how it's planned for cars. Same with Calgary, same with the majority of North American cities are built with cars in mind. And then what's kind of happening here is, I guess, resurgence, or trying to think, what are other modes of transportation and how that perhaps benefits other, spaces and places, right? Like, can we be efficient about cars and about foot? Can we be efficient about this? And I think that that's like most people kind of default into being a car. And I also think, whether or not you've lived here for many generations or you're a recent immigrant, when you get a car and you realize what that symbolizes, as far as like you can afford one, you don't have to go on the bus no more. You're moving up in life. Like, there is a little bit of like that understanding of like what a car symbolizes in our culture versus, I think Vancouver is probably an anomaly. Most people think like, okay, well, it's great to have a car, but you have to be so rich and have so much space to be able to park it and then worry about parking, and most people find it a hassle. But like here it's still quite achievable. It's like the Canadian Edmonton dream is like one day you can get a car and go to IKEA.
Yeah, it symbolizes freedom, right?
So when people talk about cars and restricting cars, I think like it's like that's what they hear versus more options. Like your car's still there, but now also people can walk, you know, and I've never driven a car legally. And so like for me, I'm always thinking in my mind biking, bus riding, or walking. And I live in a community in which I don't have to think about the hassle of transport. But there's definitely neighborhoods in the city, we all know.
Totally.
That like the only option is car, unless you want to take a very long bike ride or an extremely long walk. And if you're going to go grocery shopping or going to, like it's like you have to buy into that community. You have to have this type of vehicle.
You do. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but biking in cities and in Edmonton is extremely hostile and dangerous. I got my driver's license this past year, and I used to live downtown, and I was like, oh, I never even think about needing a car. And then I moved 10 minutes by car north, and now my bus ride to get here would be 40 minutes. It takes me 10 minutes to drive. Like our city is just not, the infrastructure just isn't there for people to easily get around. And I think that is a really tricky thing when we want to talk about sustainability and reducing your emissions, is that not everybody has the luxury to do that.
For example, I live about an hour to 45 minutes outside of Edmonton. So I do drive my car in and out of the city to get to work, to get to university. It's a long commute. And if I were to take the bus, I would be commuting for about 4 hours every day, because there is a bus that runs from Spruce Grove into Edmonton. And it is a choice, and it is like the freedom of movement. Like I benefit from the freedom of movement that my vehicle gives me. And when we're talking about politics of space, it is vastly different between Edmonton and a place like Oxford in the UK, which is where it originated. Like Oxford is a university city. It is very walkable, and it is very easy to get around because it's built around the university that's there, and everything is very close together, the shops, the pubs, everything. And when translating that idea to Edmonton, it's almost not just about the freedom, it's also a sense of identity, an Edmontonian identity, because the 15-minute city concept was created in Europe as well by I believe he was Chilean. His name escapes me at the moment. But he coined the term when he was teaching in France. So it's all a European urban planning concept for sustainability. And when taking a concept that is very successful in Europe, in the way that their cities were designed, and applying it to Edmonton, like Elyse said, it's very hard to do that because of the way that our cities are built and the social politics here. But in the case of freedom and vehicles, it also is a part of Edmontonian identity, is being able to drive and get around. And if you try to implement urban planning, things that work in places like Europe, like we're not Europe. We have Manchester Square, which looks like Europe, but it is not Europe.
Yeah. No, it's not Europe when you put a whole parking lot in front of charming looking buildings.
No.
It's like that's not Europe.
No. And I'm not an urban planner, so I don't know the answers to these difficult topics.
Neither am I.
However, I think it's really important to consider the place that is being designed for these initiatives. Like Edmonton was the reason they wanted to do that Edmonton is so spread out. The reason that Edmonton is so spread out is because they discovered oil near Nisku, and then suddenly there was this huge sprawl south, and suddenly people needed to get from Oliver to Nisku, and they needed roadways to do so and cars to do so, and now we have this huge ring road with 1 million people, huge city, tiny population. I don't. It's just
Shout out to the Anthony Henday.
it's just tough. Like I think it's really important to consider the environment and the culture of the city when trying to impose or improve sustainability initiatives. And well, my identity is not tied to my massive Dodge Ram, which I do not have. A lot of people's are. So how do we communicate to those people? Like, how do we communicate to people who have different values and different ethics than we do?
I think it's also, so if we have a car culture, which we do, it's more odd to not have a car than it is to have one. Can testify by all the conversations I have when people realize I don't drive. They're like, what? But if we think about like sustainability in cars aren't going away anytime soon. We know that it's just not going to happen. It's especially here. It's too tied up in a lot of people's identities, and I understand it. It's nice to know you can just pop over to the mountains and appreciate a hike. It's like people take, an oil guzzling car to go and walk around and enjoy nature. Like it's this weird balance. But if we think about like highways, right? People back in the 1970s, urban planners were thinking, how do we as conveniently, as quickly move a bunch of cars? Because if it's not a very fast route, you have more people lingering, idling, clogging up roadways, emissions, such like that. So if someone can find like a 50-minute route on their car versus a 40-minute route, how much less gas are they using? How much less emissions are they producing into the air? So in a way, it's like, okay, well, this highways was to try and like get people in and out as soon as possible. And the Anthony Henday is the same sort of thing. Like that was built to try and like get people to cut through and around the city instead of like clogging up the Yellowhead or the White Mud, which are other major highways that cut through Edmonton. So it's like all kind of wrapped up in a part of these highways being some of this weird sustainable outlook of like how we're trying to at least efficiently move cars. And then again, it's just that cars seem to be the de facto understanding of how do we, it's not moving cars, but also moving people. Is, again, like, I don't know how it happens, but Europe and Britain benefited from having other vehicles prior to cars. And then they started thinking about that. And so it's like that always kind of came alongside the cars, whereas in here you had like what? Wagons, horses, and then cars. There was like one train.
Yeah.
Across an entire, how big is Canada? How long is Canada? And it just like never had the chance to.
How new is Canada?
Exactly.
Still,
As far as the infrastructure goes with like, new vehicle structures and such like that. And like that just, it was like Canada didn't have a chance.
Well, there was never that slow evolution of goat of human dragging something to goat to horse to car. It was just like locomotive.
We did have the railway, and then that did not turn out as planned. When you look at the plan, at the Trans-Canadian Railway or whatever it's called, that was initially planned after, what was it, around the early 1900s. Yeah, that failed.
Well, there was Edmonton-Yukon Pacific Railroad, which was proposed to go from Edmonton, shocker, to the Yukon. But it was like this bizarre little ring road around Edmonton, and it horribly tanked.
Anyways, but that's one of the reasons why we wanted to add a historical aspect to the paper and the podcast, and then look at a modern take on public transportation and urban planning, is for that context, so that people know the history of the ravine and the spaces that we live in, to understand why things are the way they are, but also why they need to change for the future and in what way they should change. Right?
Well, and I think it's tough. Something that I am I get quite riled up about, but I need to do more research on, is the blame shifting strategies of large corporations to the individual for climate change initiatives. I wrote a paper with Heather Hutchinson, which was published and edited by Claire Wolsey.
Yeah. Check out the previous volume of Earth Common Journal for that.
Yeah, so check out the Earth Common Journal website to read that article. But in that article, we talk about the egregious acts of huge corporations, their emissions, etc., and then contrast that with how responsibility is pushed onto the consumer for the actions of these corporations and for just using the systems and the infrastructure that's set in place for them to survive in our beautiful capitalist world. And of course, I think that everybody needs to take some kind of responsibility for what they're doing and the impact that they're having on our earth. However, to be able to reflect on that is to be in a pretty lucky position. Like, not everyone can not have a car. Not everyone can use, like, it's so trivial. Like the idea of a plastic straw. I won't go on a rant, but not everyone can have the luxury of being as sustainable as possible, you know?
It's nuanced.
And it's subjective too.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And I think that the complexity is the reason to continue to have the conversations with, I don't know, a multitude of different people who represent different things, to maybe say, like, hey, you know, what do you think? Like, the government, as somewhat abstract as it might seem, is a group of people like us doing jobs that they may or may not be passionate about or as informed. And I think it is important that, you know, those are the people who are interacting with those who live in that community. Like, I am being affected by that. And again, like, that there should be a conversation. You know, the government officials should be inundated with community members wanting to talk with them and talk to them about that. Like, I think that it just showed how Mill Creek didn't let go and continued talking. At least those communities represented in that area continued, you know, wanted to create that conversation, not only with people who could possibly enact policy change, but also people who may or may not agree with them.
Totally.
You
and
know,
people who have vested interests. Like, the interesting thing in that case is that it really, at its core, is just a bunch of people who live in the same neighborhood talking about issues that affect all of them, which is why I think community leagues are so cool, because you can bring up an issue and you can have it heard, and chances are you'll have someone who maybe feels the same way as you, maybe has a different opinion, but y'all are living in that place and you all have something to gain, lose, etc. from that decision. So being able to connect with the people in your sphere and then, you know, bring that to a council meeting, that's huge power right there.
do you feel more prepared or more at ease with the possibility of going to council, reaching out to a local government representative, you know, through the exploration of your paper? Do you feel more comfortable with it, like having done this research, or not? And if so, why?
I mean, I've never shied away from a bylaw complaint. I know my bylaw officer by name. Yeah, I mean, I think working with a community league was a really positive experience. Like, at the end of the day, the people who work or who volunteer at your community league are, you know, lawyer, grocery store employee. Like, they're just like people who are bopping around in the neighborhood. And you've likely seen them before because they often go on walks. Like, I don't think that these things need to be as scary as they seem. Like, it's
just people.
Yeah. And
like, they may be in charge of something or have a fancy position, but they're just people.
Well, and if they're there, they want to talk to you.
Yeah, and I think that if they have more conversations with just the regular folk, the citizens, that perhaps that starts to like soften the edges of any sort of performative political identity, which I can see as like an armor. It can, I think it definitely ages you, politics. I think it can definitely grind on you. So perhaps it is having those conversations to remind yourself, oh yeah, I'm just part of this community. I just help represent this community, you know, rather than talking to other political folk. I wonder if that kind of echo chamber, that installation, like, does not do favors to change or, community or their own personality. Like, they don't benefit from that.
Yeah. And I mean that, like, the people at the league are much more approachable than people in council. Although people in council are still, like, approachable. I say that with a bit of hesitation, but, like, you work your way up. You go talk to your community league. You get comfortable with that, and then maybe you go talk to council. Like baby steps, right?
Baby steps.
Yeah.
What about you, Claire? I was going to say, do you feel like you can approach council chambers more by having seen how people had done it prior?
I'm not much of a public speaker.
I'll write a letter, she says.
Yeah. You have so much to say.
No, I have engaged. Like, there are ways to engage if you're not comfortable too with, like, going to a town council meeting. Like, you can letter write, you can email too. They have the councilors and community leagues have email addresses. Like, there are other ways to express your concerns or communicate them, or also just kind of see what's up and see if there are things that you can contribute or would like to speak on.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. It feels like my agency grows if I just start talking to anybody about something, and then talking to more people who have some history, if not like expertise in the field, and then keep going. It's like, wow, never knew I could do this kind of stuff. You were going to say something, Emily.
I was just going to say that one interesting thing, it's a little, well, it's not off topic, but in relation to talking to essentially people who are in charge, is that specifically like with the 15-minute city protest that happened on White Avenue. Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. Here at the university, we take a strategic communications class, and when I took the class, it was taught by, I believe his name is Glenn Kubish, and he works with the strategic communications team at the city of Edmonton. And while the protest was happening and being planned on White Avenue, he started asking the class for suggestions. And somebody said, why don't you just go talk to them? Like, why don't people from the city of Edmonton just go to the protest and talk to people? And that's what he did. He suggested it to his team, and and two of them showed up. One of them was from the urban planning division, I believe, and one was from the communications team. And they just set up a little stall at the protest just to talk to people and answer people's questions. And one thing that he said that they found was that a lot of the people that were at that protest did not know exactly what was happening. And so when they explained to them what the initiative was, what the 15-minute city initiative was, which was basically just making communities more walkable and make things more accessible, then people were like, oh, I didn't know that that's what this was. And so a lot of people left because they did not realize what it was until they were able to talk to someone. And it's that representation again. Like I said, they're just people. Like, it's not a big bad corporation. It's not a panel of people that are waiting to strike you down should you disagree with them. Like, you can oppose and have dialogue and discussion. And that was one example where not everybody was open to them being there. But a lot of the people that did talk to them learned something about what was actually happening. And it's like I said, it's just people, and it's just talking about it. And once you usually learn more about it, then it gets easier to figure out what's going on and have an opinion and get involved, whether it be within a community league and just asking a question, or just going and sitting and checking out a meeting and seeing, just to see what's happening, and not just sitting at home grumping about it, right? Because otherwise you're just like, grumble, I hate that the league is doing this, or I don't like that my community is doing this, or this bylaw was passed and I hate it. Well, that's great, but what are you gonna do about it? Like, you could grumble about that, or you can go sit in a meeting and just see what it's about and It's not a big, scary organization, like I said, that's going to strike you down should you disagree or bring up something, because even a disagreeing opinion creates dialogue and conversation and a new perspective that maybe they didn't think about. And maybe it is a big deal and other people agree with you, but you don't know unless you get out there and like sit in with people. Like, again, it's just people. They're not scary. And it's okay to disagree. But that's what creates dialogue, and that's what leads to change. So that's I'm going to get off my soapbox now.
I love that. I think, showing up with the intention for conversation says a lot. I think that's, part of it. And then people who may be willing to have their mind changed were the ones that would have had their mind changed. And those who were like, nope, I'm already set in stone, then sure. I just wonder, what does it do to a culture of people who forget that it is actually their complete democratic right to sit in and to inquire and to ask and to question and to debate with government officials, with community league officials, with anybody who can officiate over, a space or place that you co-occupy with other people. Like, what does that do? If we complain about how a city manifests, yet the majority of us do nothing to help manifest it, are we arguing against our own laziness? Or are we being like, these city officials, they keep getting it wrong? It's like, well, yeah, there's like 5,000 of them and there's 1 million of us. And if there's only 5 irate, people over the phone lobbying these 5,000 people, then it's like, what kind of representative city are we going to get? And how do you inspire that? And I think you're right about it's not scary. These are just people. But how do people grow up with an understanding that government isn't scary or unachievable? And the only thing that is scary and unachievable is when we stop trying to have a conversation with it. I think that's the scary point, is when it's just taken for granted that they have not the best interest, because you don't know what everybody wants, but you don't know what people want. The community doesn't know what they want. And maybe I
think that's where a lot of fear comes from, is that people fear what they don't understand. For example, I am not a political science person because I never really understood it in class. I feel like the way that it was taught to me in schools made it very complicated and very unapproachable. And I felt that way about a lot of public policy, and just anything related. Someone would say it's like somebody saying math. And if you're not good at math, you immediately get anxious. It's like if somebody starts talking politics, I get anxious because I don't know what people are talking about.
But I think that's an important thing that you touched on, is that it's okay not to know. It's okay to acknowledge that you were wrong, that you don't understand, that you still have more to learn. I think a lot of people are scared because they feel like they don't belong, and they don't see their peers engaging with local government or with policy change, which is why it's so important for those who feel so empowered to be active in their community and to volunteer and to exercise their civic right to vote. I see so many people who don't vote. Go vote. It's so important that you exercise your right to be involved in your community and to shape the way that you want things to go, because we all live here. And even if you don't understand something, you can go and you can ask questions and you can learn. Mm-hmm. But if, not to get on my soapbox and be all inspirational, but if we don't do it, no one will. And then these things will start happening, like Jacqueline said, that we don't want to see happening. And then we grumble. But yeah, is it our inaction, or is it because bad things are happening? Which came first?
It's a chicken or the egg
Yeah.
question, right?
Tough.
Yeah, but I think it's important about showing here are some steps. This is how simple it was. There are community leagues. There are community leaders. There is time. There's a roadmap per se. There's people who have this knowledge, and you can learn from it and see that it actually works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of corporations' goal to cause inaction among consumers is to make them feel guilty, to make them feel like they're not doing enough. Oh, I used a plastic straw today, so I'm a bad environmentalist, or I drove my car today, so that means I'm bad. like, you can still do those things, but push for sustainable change. Like you're never going to be perfect because this isn't a perfect system that we live in. Like, the system is not designed for you to succeed in sustainability initiatives. It's designed for you to what's the opposite of succeed? To fail. It's designed to continue this disgusting cycle. Like, and if we pretend that this doesn't exist, and we pretend that there is a way for us to be pure in this system, it's never going to change because we'll just consistently fail. We'll keep doing these save the turtle BS initiatives that don't result in any change. So I think starting from a local point, like starting somewhere where you can make a difference, where you can talk to people in person or online, like either way, but where you can talk to people who are facing similar issues as you, it's a great place to start.
Well, it's a really interesting, the way that you were talking about how a lot of pressure is put on the individual as opposed to the big corporations, because it almost feels like those big initiatives, those big blanket initiatives are being put on individuals, and the little tiny nitty gritty specific things are kind of expected of the corporations. Like, it's backwards. Whereas those subjective things that can be altered and adopted by individuals should be within the individual sphere when it comes to sustainability. If you can do that thing, then do that thing. If it, like, whether it's, I don't know, using, like packing your lunch in a lunchbox that you wash instead of a paper bag or something that you're just going to throw away, or like whatever, or using a water bottle instead of buying a bottle of water. Like, that's something an individual can do, whereas those big blanket initiatives should be imposed on corporations, right?
Yeah, but then we see this this capitalistic turn where it's like, okay, I'm using a reusable water bottle, but now I have 12. Or like the grocery store isn't giving me a plastic bag anymore, so now I have 15 plastic reusable bags. I will get on a soapbox about this too, because I used to use plastic grocery bags as garbage bags, but now I have to buy garbage bags because I can't get a plastic grocery bag.
Same.
So annoying.
Same. And it's way cheaper, like 5 cents a bag. Like I broke that down. I'm like, this is always going to be cheaper than buying plastic bags for my garbage. But I think, it's like manageable, manageable things.
I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I'm not getting at go buy a water bottle. Like, do that if that works for you and you can afford to do that. What I meant is that, like, subjective options that you are capable of doing, because, like you said, not everybody comes from the same socioeconomic background. Not everybody can afford the fancy stainless steel lunchbox that can't be microwaved, which doesn't make sense to my brain. But you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like,
totally. I'm just saying that things get skewed. Like, these things become trends, and then people buy like 15 reusable forks when you could just use the fork from your drawer.
Well, perhaps it's an idea of like what's manageable, what's achievable. And perhaps people think if I just stop using plastic straws, that's something that I can incorporate, right?
Yeah.
But then if it's turned into a place where you're starting to buy 14 metal straws and you have themes, and then you're like, I don't really like this straw anymore, it's kind of chipped, and then you throw it out, and then like, how does that decompose? And there's all those things. And it's like, well, if that's shown, if that's marketed as that's the easy thing to do, and people want to feel like they're doing something and feel good about doing something, but at the same time, it's like, what becomes less marketable are the things that maybe do not require products in which to do, which is like the product, the thing that you're buying or using is your time to call up, to meet with a neighbor, to say, hey, I want to park. What can we do about this? I know so-and-so has something to do with this policy, so we should reach out to them. Like, that's not as marketable. But in a way, you could say, well, it's achievable because that person lives in your city, and the person who's in charge of that also lives in your city, and they have a phone number, they have an email, you can write them a letter. But, it's like, I think it's, people want to find achievable goals, but how do they know, again, how do you demystify the ladder process versus buying a straw? Like, those should both be somewhat achievable, and then it's like a question of what would actually inspire more power and agency in them. Not buying plastic straws, or being able to advocate for a park in their community, and then from there, where would they go? But if like your agency comes in capital and buying, then it's like you're not really outside of that system. But yet people, again, the intentions are there to try, but it's like it's still that system.
Yeah, it's so tough. Like it always, I see it often come back to this accusation of purity and like you're not doing enough. Like you see this a ton, like within the vegan community too. Like you're not vegan enough, etc. You're not enough of an environmentalist, which is a tactic that was imposed by these corporations called the hypocrite's trap. Like it was intended for people to call out their fellow neighbors and say, like, you drive a car, like, you're not doing enough. And then those people feel unempowered. They feel like they're not doing enough. And then they say, well, nothing will ever be good enough. They stop trying. So I think that's why it's so important to maybe look outside of what you can buy or what you can change about yourself. What you can change about how you interact with your world within your power, maybe, and look at what you can do. Like, what can I do in my local sphere? Who can I talk to?
Relationship build.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do I relationship build in order to affect kind of more abstract change or non-abstract change if it's like a physical, like I actually want this thing built.
And then you build that community, and then you have those relationships, and you have people around you that are working towards the same thing, that want the same thing, and it reinforces that action instead of you feeling like you're on an island.
And that's also how you can make it easier for other people to make those changes too, or even just making more sustainable changes accessible to people. Like, for instance, now it's not fully rolled out to everyone, but apparently it is coming to people who live in apartments, is the city's composting program that's been rolled out in the past few years. So now that makes, before that, if you didn't have a backyard compost, which is work to do and takes some time to set up and maintain, or a compost bin if you live in an apartment, which I live in an apartment, I still have a compost bin, but obviously that's not accessible to everybody, and not everybody has the knowledge and the resources to do that. But now there's a composting program, so that actually makes it really accessible to the everyday citizen. There's a system in place that's pretty simple. You fill up your compost bin, you put it out with your garbage, and then that goes to the city's industrial composting facility. And now that's made a really sustainable change, dealing with food waste or dealing with just the bits of the tomato or whatever bit of food that is not the edible part. And now that doesn't just go to the landfill, that actually does go to a system that helps it. So yeah, like, that's the thing, is because people have pushed for changes like that, now it's accessible to everybody. Like, that's accessible to the everyday person. Like, when you put water bottle refill stations everywhere, that means that it's easier for people to carry water bottles and refill those water bottles. And so when you make those kind of systemic changes, it means that those actions are easier for individuals to do and more accessible for them.
And if you don't know how to compost, the Nature Center by Fort Edmonton Park has a composting workshop that you can go to, which I saw when we were there.
Yeah, there's such a thing of being called like a master composter. Like it's a title, it's a thing. There's that's a whole other world. As you're speaking, Claire, of saying, like, the reason why we have this composting program that's growing and building, and now it's coming into apartments. Hurrah! I'm so glad for that. And to know that came from people who were advocating for it. I think it would be a really neat campaign if to maybe help instill agency, as in, like, you could also do this too, is to have a campaign of the stories behind the new policies that come in. Who were the people? How many people? What did they do to make the compost a reality? And that could be associated with all these different things that are happening in the city, to say, like, oh, well, they did it because there was like 5 of them. Okay, so I only need 5 people at least. And they called these people, they talked to these people, they got this many signatures. Okay, and like just see and map out the process in which they did that, kind of like how you were looking at like Mill Creek. Who are the people behind it? You have the nutters, right? And so to have that associated with how this came to be, as in, like, all this came to be not just from some person in the comms or some person in urban planning coming up with an idea. It'd be interesting to see how much of it came from community sourced ideas and how many of them needed to be behind that before it was put into like legislation or whichever, like enacted. I think that would be a really interesting like campaign to see and just go, oh, it's achievable. It's only one person.
That's such a good idea.
It is.
Yeah, I feel like people are so disempowered often. Like they see these big initiatives happening, like, oh, compost in apartments, like, and
that could be a series.
That
could be a podcast
series.
series.
That is such a good idea. City of Edmonton, I hope you're listening.
All we need to do is just come up with the idea, pitch it, say we'll do the research.
Right?
We're gonna search it out, just use it.
Yeah.
Or we'll have like an adjacent website or something to that extent. Because I think that's again, like, how do you instill it? It just needs to look achievable. People need a roadmap. Like, how do we know to do strategic communications or to build a website? Is because we had a roadmap show to us by an instructor or online or something. Like we learned through. I mean, I think it was Socrates that said, like, we learn through, like, mimicry. Like it's kind of like sometimes we just need to see it.
Totally.
Some people can envision it, and they're so great at envisioning it, they know how to do it because they they see it in their minds. But most of us, large majority of us, need to see somebody else do it, know how they did it, and then, like, great.
Well,
like, that's the kind of followers I'm going to be on my soapbox. That's the kind of
Yeah.
followers we need is, like, you know, I don't know, in an agency kind of way.
Totally. Well, and how Emily was saying that she's intimidated by the political process. If you see how some of these civic actions are being played out, and you read an interview or you listen to a podcast with the leader of this initiative, who's probably your neighbor, like, you're like, oh, she did it, so I can do it too. Oh, I have a bunch of rogue dogs in my neighborhood. Like, how can I take action about this, you know? I don't actually have rogue dogs in my neighborhood, and if I did and they were nice, I'd probably be okay with it. But
I have rogue cats. There's always rogue cats in my neighborhood, and I'm just always happy to see a cat somewhere. I'm like, hi, I know they kill all the birds,
but they also kill the mice. I had a lot of rogue cats in my neighborhood, and I was like, I'm sad for these cats because they probably won't live as long. But now that they're gone, I have mice in my yard, and I'm like, rats.
Rats. No, you mean mice.
Mice.
I have a family of skunks. So.
Angels.
Stinky angels.
They are very
Literally
cute.
They're so cute. But yeah. Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end it. A great discussion, and we've got so many ideas for new series.
Yay!
So we'll all have you back again the following year to see what else we're up to, right? Claire, Elyse, Emily.
Yeah, I'm down.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming out, and we'll see you all at the launch in November.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Can't wait to do it again. Thanks for listening to The Launch Pod. I've been your host, Jacqueline Ohm.